I wasn't even trying to catch him in anything. I just had my camera out at a wedding snapping candid shots the way I always do at every wedding I've ever attended when I overheard a woman at the next table say plain as anything, mid-conversation with somebody else entirely. "Oh, that's Derek, Kayla's husband." My fiancé's husband, apparently, to a wife I'd never once heard mentioned in 3 years together. 3 years of conversations. 3 years of meeting his family and friends. 3 years and not one single word about a wife. I looked down at the photo I'd just taken without even meaning to, and there it was, proof of something I was about to spend the next 6 weeks unraveling piece by careful piece. My name is Sydney Marsh, I'm 28 years old, and I live outside Denver, Colorado. Before I get into it, y'all drop your city or state down in the comments. I always love knowing who's out there listening tonight, wherever in the world that happens to be. I met Derek at a mutual friend's barbecue 3 years ago. Both of us reaching for the same bag of chips, laughing about it the rest of the night. The way you do when something clicks easy right from the start, when you can already tell a person's going to matter before you've even learned their last name. He worked as a project manager for a construction firm, steady and funny, and genuinely kind in the ordinary ways that matter more than the flashy ones, the kind of guy who remembered how you took your coffee after hearing it once. We dated 2 years before he proposed on a hiking trail we'd done a dozen times before, ring box shaking slightly in his hand, both of us a little out of breath from the climb, and I said yes without a single moment's hesitation, genuinely certain I was looking at the rest of my life. Derek didn't talk much about his early 20s, which I'd always chalked up to him just being a private guy about certain things, the kind of person who lived more in the present than the past. He'd mention vague and quick that he'd dated somebody seriously back in the day. Didn't work out changing the subject, smooth enough that I never once thought to press harder, and I never pushed harder than that. Figuring everybody's got a chapter or two, they'd rather leave closed some early mistake or heartbreak that doesn't need excavating just to prove love in the present. Looking back now, I understand that vagueness a whole lot differently than I did at the time. Understand now it wasn't privacy at all. It was something being carefully managed. If you've ever trusted somebody's version of their own past without ever once thinking to check it, I want to know. Tell me in the comments what that felt like once you learned there was more to it. About 8 months into our engagement, Derek's old college friend Nate invited us out to his wedding in a resort town, a few hours outside Denver, a whole weekend affair with a rehearsal dinner and a big reception the following evening. The kind of destination wedding that meant packing for 2 full days of events. Derek seemed a little off in the weeks leading up to it, more distracted than usual, checking his phone, more mentioning once almost too casual that a lot of people from that old crowd would probably be there. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured weddings bring out everybody's nerves, a little old friend group reunions carrying their own particular kind of anxiety. We arrived Friday evening for the rehearsal dinner, checking into our hotel room with barely enough time to change before heading over, and Derek seemed tense the whole night, scanning the room in a way I noticed, but didn't quite know how to name. Yet his eyes drifting toward the entrance every few minutes, like he was bracing for something. At one point, a woman I didn't recognize walked in with 2 young kids in tow, a boy who looked maybe 5 and a girl closer to 3. And I watched Derek's whole body go rigid across the room. Watched him excuse himself from our conversation a little too fast to go say something quiet to her near the doorway. His hand landing briefly on the little boy's shoulder in a gesture that looked even from across the room more practiced than a stranger's would. If you've ever watched somebody you loved go tense at the sight of a total stranger and felt that particular cold drop in your stomach before you even had a reason to name it, watch their whole posture change in a room full of people who had no idea anything was wrong, I want to know how you handled that feeling. And stick around because we're only just now getting to the part where I understood exactly why he'd gone so pale and exactly how long he'd been carrying that particular kind of fear around with him. I asked him about her later that night back in our hotel room, keeping my voice light, even though something in me had already started keeping careful track, folding my dress over the back of a chair while I waited for his answer. Who was that woman with the kids? He said her name was Kayla, An old family friend from way back said it fast and moved the conversation along to something about the ceremony timeline for the next day. The transition so smooth I almost let it slide right past me. I let it go, though I noticed filing it away the way you do when something doesn't quite sit right, but you don't yet have the words for why lying awake a little longer than usual that night turning it over. The reception the next evening was beautiful string lights strung between old oak trees and a live band playing something slow, and I spent most of it doing what I always do at weddings, camera out, capturing candid little moments to send to friends, later catching the flower girl mid-spin, catching the best man's toast, catching at one point, without even meaning to Derek across the room, holding that same little boy on his hip, laughing easy, natural, the kind of easy you don't fake with a kid. You barely know the boy's small hand curled comfortable around Derek's collar like it belonged there. I lowered my camera a moment, watching that scene play out from a distance, something uneasy, building slow in my chest, my thumb still resting on the shutter button out of habit, when the woman at the next table, mid-conversation with somebody else, entirely said the line that split my whole evening in half without even realizing she'd said anything remarkable at all. "Oh, that's Derek, Kayla's husband. They've been together since college. Has he not mentioned her?" Would y'all have confronted him right there at the reception or waited the way I did? I'd love to know down in the comments. And if you've ever had one overheard sentence rearrange your entire understanding of somebody you loved, hit that subscribe button, because what I found out over the following 6 weeks is exactly why I finally understood what that photo I'd taken by accident actually proved. I called my best friend Priya the second we got back to our hotel room that night, stepping into the bathroom with the fan running so Derek wouldn't hear whispering the whole story out in a rush. Priya, practical as ever, didn't waste time on shock. "Sydney, do not say anything to him yet. Get home, get the actual paperwork, then decide what you're dealing with. Don't let him talk his way around something you haven't even confirmed yet." Her voice on the other end of that call was the steadiest thing about that entire weekend, and it's the reason I managed to hold my composure through one more full day of smiling at a wedding I could barely focus on. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled through the rest of the reception, danced with Derek during the last song, kissed him goodnight in our hotel room with a calm. I genuinely don't know how I managed to fake that convincingly lying beside him afterwards, staring at the ceiling for hours, replaying that single overheard sentence on a loop. But the second we got home Sunday evening, bags still half unpacked in the hallway, I started quietly digging the way you do. Once a single sentence has cracked something open, you can't just close back up again. I pulled up the photo I'd taken, the one with Derek and that little boy, and studied it a long while. The resemblance between them sitting there plain, once I actually let myself look for it instead of away from it. The same jawline, the same particular way of squinting when he smiled. I searched Kayla's name alongside Derek's, found a public records site, and paid the small fee to search Colorado marriage records under both their names. Together, my hands unsteady on the keyboard the whole time. The certificate came back within minutes, faster than I was ready for. Derek and Kayla had married 11 years ago when he would have been 22. A courthouse ceremony in a small mountain town, 2 hours from where we lived now, the kind of place you'd drive through without ever stopping if you didn't already know somebody there. There was no divorce filing anywhere in the state records. Not one, not partial, not pending, nothing at all, indicating the marriage had ever been formally dissolved. As far as the state of Colorado was concerned, Derek Simmons was still a legally married man, married to a woman he'd introduced to me, when pressed at all, as an old family friend. If you've ever pulled a single public record and had your entire understanding of somebody's life come apart in the space of one document, I want to know how you manage the hours right after that. And this next part is exactly why I finally called Derek's oldest friend Nate the morning after the wedding before I ever said a word to Derek himself. Nate, to his credit, didn't play dumb when I asked him plain over the phone voice, careful if he'd known Derek was still married. There was a long pause, long enough that I had my answer before he even said anything, the silence stretching out uncomfortable over the line. "Sydney, I figured you knew, he finally said, sounding genuinely uncomfortable, like he'd been dreading this exact conversation without ever quite admitting that to himself. They got married young, right out of high school, basically had Ethan not long after. It fell apart pretty fast, but I don't think either of them ever actually got around to the paperwork. I assumed that was just, a formality he'd handle eventually. He paused again, quieter this time. I should have said something at the wedding. I just didn't think it was my place. 11 years of a formality he'd never handled, and 2 kids I hadn't known existed until a stranger mentioned them casually at a reception table. Nate's own guilty silence, just one more layer of a secret that had apparently been sitting in plain sight to everybody except me. I confronted Derek that same evening, laid the marriage certificate printout on our kitchen table between us, the same table where he'd once shown me the ring he'd picked out kneeling right there on that same kitchen floor 8 months earlier. He went pale reading it, same as he had at that rehearsal dinner, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all, just stared down at that piece of paper, like it might rearrange itself into something less permanent if he looked long enough. Then he told me the truth finally, in pieces, his voice low and unsteady in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before. He and Kayla had married at 22 young and reckless, had their son Ethan within the first year, and the marriage had fallen apart hard within 18 months, both of them moving on with their lives separately, Kayla eventually having a second child with somebody else years later. But the divorce paperwork, expensive and complicated given how young and broke they'd both been at the time, had simply never gotten filed, and as the years passed, it became easier to just not think about it, to describe himself as basically divorced to anyone who asked, technically still legally married to a woman he hadn't lived with in a decade. The lie small enough at first that it never felt like it needed correcting until it had grown too large and too old to correct without consequence. I was going to handle it before the wedding, he said, quiet, not quite meeting my eyes, his hands folded tight on the table between us. I just kept putting it off. 11 years of putting it off, including the entire 3 years he'd spent building a life and a proposal with me. Never once mentioning that our own wedding, had we gone through with it as planned, would have made me an accidental party to bigamy. In the eyes of the law, a legal complication he'd apparently decided wasn't urgent enough to disclose to the woman he was asking to marry him. I called off the engagement 2 days later. Not out of anger at the marriage itself. People's early 20s are complicated, messy things, mistakes made young that don't always define who a person becomes, but at 3 years of him choosing not to tell me something, this fundamental letting me build an entire future, an entire wedding registry, an entire imagined life around a legal reality, he knew wasn't true the whole time. I reached out to Kayla myself about a month after everything came apart, tracking down her number through Nate, unsure, right up until I hit send, whether it was even my place to say anything at all. I kept the message short, just told her plainly what I'd learned, that Derek had been engaged to me the whole time, without ever mentioning their marriage was still legally active, figuring she deserved to know that much, at least whatever she decided to do with it. She wrote back within the hour, and I could feel the shock in every line of it, clearly just as blindsided by the engagement as I'd been by the marriage. We talked on the phone once after that, 2 women who'd never met, both quietly wronged by the same 11 years of paperwork nobody ever bothered filing, and there was something strange and almost comforting about not being alone in that particular kind of confusion. It's been 4 months since I gave the ring back, setting it down on that same kitchen table one final time before I packed my last box, the 2 of us barely speaking as we sorted through years of shared belongings into separate piles. Derek has finally filed the actual divorce paperwork, Nate tells me, moving through the process slow and overdue 11 years later. Then it should have happened, a formality he could no longer afford to keep putting off, now that it had cost him an engagement to unravel it. I don't know what happens for him after that, and honestly, it's not mine to track anymore. A chapter of my own life I've had to consciously close the door on and stop checking for updates about. Kayla, from what I understand, never knew Derek was engaged to someone else this whole time either, which means she's been quietly wronged by all of this too, in her own way. unknowing all these years that the man she never formally divorced was out building an entire second life without ever mentioning her existence to the woman standing right beside him at somebody else's wedding. I won't tell you this story ends with some big satisfying confrontation scene because it mostly just ended quiet. Two people packing up 3 years of shared apartment across one long, exhausting weekend, dividing furniture and forwarding mail, and returning each other's things in cardboard boxes left on the porch, the kind of ordinary logistics that make heartbreak feel almost administrative once you're actually living through it. Some days I still feel the sting of realizing how much of what I thought I knew was built on something he'd simply decided wasn't worth telling me. 3 years of small omissions I never once had reason to question, replaying old conversations now, and wondering what else might have been quietly managed the same way. Most days I'm just grateful for a stranger's careless comment at a wedding reception table, and for a habit of keeping my camera out at exactly the wrong or maybe exactly the right moment of my entire life. A coincidence I still can't quite believe worked out the way it did. I've started dating again slowly. Cautious in a way I never used to be, asking more questions early on than I ever thought to ask Derek in 3 whole years together. Priya jokes that I've become the most thorough background checker among all our friends, and I tell her only half-joking myself that I earned that particular skill the hard way, one photograph and one overheard sentence at a time. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's simple. Some lies aren't even really lies. Not exactly. They're just things somebody decided you didn't need to know. Quiet omissions dressed up as privacy. And those are sometimes the ones that cost you the most, once you finally learn them anyway, because you never even got the chance to ask the right question in the first place. Priya still asks me sometimes if I regret keeping my camera out, that whole reception half joking, half not, and I always tell her the truth. I don't regret it for a second. Some habit I've had since college, snapping ordinary little moments nobody else thinks to capture, ended up being the exact thing that kept me from spending the rest of my life legally married to a man who was already quietly still married to somebody else. I'm Sydney Marsh. I'm 28 years old, and I caught my fiancé in a lie he'd been quietly carrying for 11 years, not through anything he ever said, but through one photograph I took completely by accident, and one sentence I was never even supposed to overhear at somebody else's wedding.